This is another chapter that is a little bit longer. So I'm thinking it's going to end up over 2 days, but I guess we'll see how long it takes me to go through all this information. So the general idea is we're going to take a quick, well, there's going to be basically three parts to this lecture. The first part, we're going to look at the evolution of early animals, right? So basically from simple creatures that just basically have like no brain and radial symmetry and no symmetry whatsoever, to more complicated organisms like insects and squid and stuff like that. Then we're going to take a quick cruise through the vertebrates, and we're going to talk about evolution of vertebrates. So basically from jawless fishes like a lamprey and a hagfish all the way down to mammals. And then once we get to the mammals, we're going to take a look at human evolution specifically and kind of talk about some of the major, really, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. We're only going to talk about 4 or 5 members of the hominid clade and kind of how we fit in with the primates overall. And then the last part of it is we're going to talk about just kind of some unique aspects of being human and some things that have undergone selective pressures and have caused us to be the way we are. So we'll see how much we get through. So I probably mentioned before, evolution of animal life is omitted from integrative biology. It's a pretty common topic to have in an introductory to biology course, but because of decisions that were made long before I was even hired here, it's never been a topic we've covered. The basic philosophy is that because you guys are going to go into the health sciences, you really don't need to know a whole lot about animal life. And I can see the argument, and I don't know how I feel about it. There's been some movement to include it, but whatever. Well, it is what it is, okay? So the first part where we talk about invertebrate evolution and vertebrate evolution, so I guess the first 2 parts, are specifically an attempt to supplement that. I took this information from Brooker's chapters 33 through 35, and I condensed it, right? So we're going into much less detail than they do in the Brooker text. So that's where the source information is from. You don't have to look at the Brooker text, but if you're curious, that's what you can look for. Just so you know, for the exam, you're responsible for what is covered in these slides, the questions on the content page, and then anything that's covered in urine or fish that hits on this, which I believe there'll be some overlap with what we talked about in urine or fish. And yeah, I'm sorry we didn't cover this in integrative, and you guys have to do it now, but it's actually really interesting stuff, and I don't think it'll be too bad. If you guys have more questions, I'm assuming that there'll probably be some anxiety in terms of like, well, what do we need to know for the exam? And I'll airmail this to you guys a little bit more, just because you don't have the content from the book. But we can talk about that later, okay? So let's start out, let's talk about like what an animal is. So if you aren't familiar, another name for animal is metazoan. So if you see the term metazoan, just be aware of that, okay? And basically, animals are multicellular heterotrophs, right? The very first multicellular organisms were likely this thing called Volvox right here, which is not an animal, right? So multicellularity developed prior to animals. I mean, obviously, fungi, plants are also multicellular. But all animals are heterotrophic. Well, with the exception of some corals have some photosynthetic bacteria, but that's more of a obligate symbiote than an actual organism. But they're all heterotrophic, so they all have to consume external energy, and they're all mobile at some point in time in their life. Even a thing like a coral is mobile at a certain point in time in its life. So those are, those are the big characteristics. Yep. Yeah, we're not the only heterotroph. Fungi are heterotrophs, so there's a lot of bacteria that heterotroph, protozoa, animals, and like I said, we're mobile. So these are examples of corals and fishes. These are all animals. To the best of my knowledge, there's no plants in this image right here, or bacteria and things like that. Like these are all animals right here. Corals are animals, and they typically have a mobile life form, at least at some point in time in their life. So there are some things we use to classify animals. And so I want to go over this stuff and talk about what it is, because we're going to talk about like some animals have this and some animals don't have this. It will develop independently, but we use these things to break them down. So the first thing we use is symmetry, right? What kind of symmetry does it have? So like porifera, the sponges, they have no symmetry, right? There's no line where you can draw and you can bisect it in half, and it's the same on both sides. Cnidaria, ctenophore, Rotifera, and starfish all have radial symmetry. So there are, multiple different ways you can cut them in half, and they'll be approximately the same on both sides. Bilateral symmetry is by far the most common body plan that you see amongst the animals, and that is because we are mobile, right? So bilateral symmetry, there is a front end that moves through the universe and a back end, and then right and left halves. And this bilateral symmetry is actually important because it leads to a process known as cephalization, which is the collection of nervous tissues and sensory tissues on the anterior end. And so cephalization is a trend that exists in the animal kingdom. Okay. The next distinction that we have is what's known as germ layers. Okay. So you can have there are three types of germ layers possible. Some organisms only have ectoderm and endoderm. Okay. Most animals have ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm. Okay. And whether these exist or not, whether they're diploblastic or triploblastic, has a impact on basically what the organism is, right? And like all tissues are derived from these very primitive tissues, okay? And we'll talk more about that later, like your muscles that are derived from mesoderm, okay? This also ties into processes of I gotta go to my next slide. Sorry. So like ectoderm, endoderm, mesoderm, if you have all three true layers, these are all the different tissues that like derive from them. So your endoderm is a lot of your internal structures, your pancreas and liver, urethra, stuff like that, right? Mesoderm is like a lot of your muscles and your stomach, excretory lymphatic system, reproductive system, and then your ectoderm is your skin for the most part, and a lot of your nervous tissues, right? So like these tissues, it's the original organization of the organism when it starts to divide and reproduce as a zygote, and then they give rise to structures later. So the absence and presence of these different germ layers helps us differentiate species. And the last, well, not the last thing, but one of the things that we will also talk about is proteosomes versus deuterostomes. Proteosomes is spelled wrong on my slides. Sorry about that. Protosomes, basically what happens is there's a stage in which all animals are just like a ball of cells, right? Like they're a hollow ball of cells, and it has to fold in on itself and form what's known as a blastula in order to begin to develop like a tube, which is your digestive tract, right? And so that's one of the first things that happens developmentally. And so the vast majority of organisms are protosomes, where in that first invagination becomes the mouth. But echinoderms and chordates, that first invagination actually becomes their anus. So they're known as deuterosomes. And so that's something that they use to differentiate. Another thing we use to differentiate is so you have this digestive tract, right, that runs throughout your body. So there are in some of them there's really no open hollow cavity besides the digestive tract. Those are known as acoelomates, right? It's like mesoderm the whole way through. The next evolutionary development we see is what's known as pseudocoelomates, where it is partially covered, right? So there's a ring of, you have ectoderm is the blue, right? And then inside of that is mesoderm, right? And then you have a tube running through there, and there's a hollow space in here in which organs can go, right? So here is the digestive tract that runs through, and that's called a pseudocoelomate, right? With true coelomates, the mesoderm wraps all the way around, and so then the hollow tube is divided into two different areas. and it's just a more complicated. The last thing we use is the degree of segmentation, right? Very primitive creatures have very little segmentation, okay? And then the first thing you see is ring segmentation, where it's like tons and tons and tons of different segments. And then you get more complicated segmentation, like you see in insects, where there's like 3 main parts, 4 main parts, 2 main parts depending on the insect. And then even in chordata, you see the segmentation where different areas of the body are divided into different regions and different compartments. So the degree of segmentation is something that we're going to talk about a lot too. All right, 1 minute. So we're going to start rolling through. We're going to start talking about organisms, and we're going to go. The basic direction is going to be the most ancestral to the most derived. Okay, so we're going to start with very, very simple ancient organisms. So the first animals are thought to be what are known as ctenophore, which are called they're comb jellyfish, right? Something happened between when I was in college and now. I was actually taught sponges were the most primitive organisms, but that doesn't appear to be the case. Regardless, the scientific consensus now says that ctenophores are the most primitive. Most people would probably call these jellyfish, and they look a lot like jellyfish, but they don't. They're phylogenetically different. There's different things going on with them. They're smaller than most jellyfishes. As you can see, there's a person holding them, and they kind of look like alien spacecrafts. I'm not going to lie to you. Like, that's what I think of. They typically have 8 rows of cilia that help that look like combs, right? And then they have 2 long sticky tentacles that they use to capture food. They're hermaphroditic, so both sexes are present, and they're bioluminescent. They have muscles, they have nervous tissue, but there's no encephalization going on, right? Like, they have what's known as a nervous net, so they can detect stimuli and respond to stimuli, but they can't do anything beyond that, right? They're pretty simple creatures. They actually have mesoderm, which is interesting, but it's likely an independent evolutionary development. Okay? They have no Hox genes, so those haven't developed yet. They are the most primitive of the organisms. Next, I'm going to talk about Cnidaria. Cnidaria are closely related to ctenophore, right? So they're oftentimes clustered together. And part of the reason is because they're similar, right? Like, they have similar in appearance and body life plan and so on and so forth. They're more speciose, they're bigger, and they're easier to see. Okay, they have 2 germ layers, not 3. And one of the things that's unique about them is that they have these specialized stinging cells, right, which are called cnidocytes, if I remember correctly. Yeah, cnidocytes. Okay, and so that's why jellyfish like really hurt when you touch them a lot of times, and they can even kill you. And basically, what happens is there's this trigger, and if you touch it, it shoots a barb into you. Okay, so that's one of the unique characteristics of this organism. They tend to have 2 different life forms. So they'll have a sessile polyp form, which is like this right here. So corals and sea anemones. That's what it looks like. And then they also have this mobile medusa form, which is more like what what you would call a jellyfish, right? And they actually tend to alternate between these 2 life stages, right? So sea anemones specifically, their juvenile form is the medusa, and then it'll find a space that's like good for it to settle down in, and then it'll form into the polyp form. Okay, so it'll alternate back and forth between those life cycles. Corals are more polyp orientated, like and jellyfish tend to have a very prolonged medusa stage. And I don't know if jellyfish have a polyp stage at all. So they don't necessarily have to have both stages, but those are the 2 morphs that come in. There's 4 major groups of them. You don't need to know those, but it's basically hydrozoa, which is like big jellyfish, Scyphonzoa, which is regular sized jellyfish. Then you have the sea anemones and coral in another group, and then you have a group that's called the box jellies. Okay. Okay, so the next group of organisms we're going to talk about is sponges, porifera, right? So they're interesting because they don't have any tissues. They just have cells, right? And like they're this aggregate of cells. And you can throw them in a blender and turn it on, and they'll reform new sponges. So it's almost like a reversion to a like unicellular state in some regards, because each one of these cells can just like reform a new organism, right? So there's no tissues going on whatsoever, but they have to live together. They're obligately, like they can't function just by themselves because they have specialization. It's a really, really interesting lifestyle, but it's almost like an evolutionary reversion because these arose actually later than ctenophore and Idaria. They have no Hox genes, so they split off before the development of Hox genes. They exhibit no symmetry whatsoever, whereas jellyfish and ctenophores have radial symmetry. Porifera has no symmetry whatsoever. They have the genes to make tissues, but they just stop doing it. So it's almost like a reversion to a more ancestral state in some regards, which if there's a niche, organisms will fill it. Jelly are really cool. They're filter feeders because they have no tissues. All digestion is intracellular, right? So like they have to like just grab stuff and bring it into their cells to break down. There's no like digestive tract. There's no circulatory system or anything like that. Really, really simple. They can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So like I said, if you put a sponge in a blender and turn it on and blend it up, it's possible to make 4 or 5 sponges, right? And then they can grow and develop from there. But they can also release sperm and egg, specialized sperm, specialized reproductive cells as well. So they can use both mechanisms of reproduction. Yeah. Okay, so those are the most primitive of the animals. Next, we're going to move into animals that tend to have a little bit more complex. These next group of organisms have a little bit more complicated of a life history pattern. And they're starting to see, like they have tissues and they have nervous systems and stuff like that. So flatworms are the next group we're going to talk about. And they're going to get progressively more and more complicated. These are kind of like the middle level of complication, right? So flatworms have no circulatory or respiratory system. So that's the reason why they have to remain flat, is because it increases their surface area and allows like diffusion of gases and nutrients and metabolic waste out. Like if they get too big, diffusion no longer works and they die. And so like these are some bigger flatworms down here that are found in the ocean, and there can be some pretty big ones. But they're still really flat, right? So they're trying to increase their surface area. This is like the classic version right here. I forget what they're called. I think they might just be called platyhelminths or helminths. They exhibit bilateral symmetry, so you can see that if you were to dissect it right down the middle, you would have paired right and left halves, okay? So this is the first time you're starting to see bilateral symmetry, okay? They have 3 true germ layers. There's ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm, but they are acoelements. So there's no open space in here whatsoever. It's tissue the entire way through, but they do have all 3 germ layers. They have a one-way or incomplete digestive system. So basically their mouth and their anus is the same opening. So they have to consume food and then regurgitate it back out, which is a huge pain in the ass. No pun intended. You're starting to see a little bit of cephalization, right? They typically have eye spots. These are the eye spots right here that can detect the absence and presence of light. And they have a tendency to move towards light. So if you shine a flashlight at them, they tend to swim towards the surface, which is weird. They have chemoreceptors in the beginning of a centralized nervous system. So here you can see it's kind of like this, it's a nervous net, but it's starting to be like you have these 2 channels going to the side, and you're starting to see a collection of nerve cells up towards the top. They have what are known as flame cells, which are like super primitive kidneys to help get rid of metabolic waste. Reproduction is sexual or asexual. Most are hermaphroditic, but they can't fertilize their own eggs. They have kind of this really strange reproductive strategy called penis fencing, where they try to stab each other with their penises, if I remember correctly. It's really weird. A lot of them are parasitic. So if you've ever heard of helminth parasites, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about platyhelminthes. But there's also a lot that are free swimming in the ocean too. All right. Next group we're going to talk about is Rotifera. Rotifera is also a really, really small microscopic organism. They have a pseudocoelom, which, as I said previously, so they have this digestive tract on the inside, but it's not completely lined with mesoderm, right? It's kind of exposed. So you have this central cavity, which allows like the development of more complicated organs, but it hasn't been lined by mesoderm yet. It's fluid-filled cavity on the inside, which serves as a kind of a hydroskeleton, which helps it preserve its shape. Yeah, and it still has that. The big thing with Rotifera is that it has a one-way digestive tract, which means it has a separated mouth and a separated anus, so you can see all the food moves in one direction. And this is a big evolutionary step in the animal kingdom, because previously, if you have a two-way digestive system, like platyhelminths have, then when you eat a meal, that's it. You can't eat anymore, right? You have to process that meal and digest that meal before you can eat another meal. With a one-way digestive tract, you can eat and poop at the same time, right? So like you can eat something, digest it, and while your body's processing it, eat some more, okay? So that was a big evolutionary step. The other thing is they developed these things called protonephridia, which is like it's the start of a kidney system, really. So like it's a very primitive system to remove metabolic waste, and they actually move it to a bladder, and then it's urinated out of a bladder. So you're starting to see the development of more complicated organ systems. Yeah. Um, Next, we're going to talk about is mollusks, because mollusks are super cool, right? So mollusks are one of the first ones that have. It's a really big group. Okay, it's a really big group. It's a really successful group. It's a really complicated group. They're one of the first organisms that have a true coelom. So organisms included in the group Mollusca are snails, slugs, clams, and a group known as cephalopods, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Their general body plan is they have a soft body under a protective shell to a varying degree. So like this is considered like the standard mollusk body plan, right? So you have gills, you have an anus, okay, you have a one-way digestive tract, you have a closed coelom, gonads, and then there's this mantle, like this mantle, hard covering and shell, okay, that helps protect you, and then you have a foot that helps you move, okay? So that's the basic body plan. They have a true coelom, but the coelom only goes around the heart, okay? Otherwise, they have an open circulatory system where they're basically just like their heart is pumping the blood into a like a large open area that bathes all the organs in the blood, and then it draws it back up, sends it to the gills, and then sends it back. So it's an open, even though they're moving their blood and they have a coelom, they're just kind of like bathing their organs in this blood and moving them back and forth. Their nervous system is hugely varied, okay? So they can have a really, really simple nervous system that just detects stimulus, right? Like in a snail, you wouldn't see a very complicated nervous system, or a mollusk or a scallop or something like that. But in a cephalopod, you have an incredibly complicated nervous system. There's way too much to discuss about the reproductive system. Like it's a huge group, okay? To give you an idea, we're going to cruise through it. So you have what's known as bivalves, right, which are the freshwater clams. So this is zebra mussels that are on another species of freshwater clams. So zebra mussels are highly invasive, right? So bivalves are a very big group. You have the marine clams, which is another very big group. Gastropods should be fairly familiar to you. They're things like nudibranchs and snails and stuff like that. And then there's the group Cephalopoda, right? Cephalopoda is, I'm not convinced that they're not aliens. I'm not going to lie to you. They're wicked smart. They can learn from observational learning. They have jet propulsion, so their foot has been modified into an organ that basically draws water in and then squirts it out, and that's what causes them to move forward. So it's primitive jet propulsion, right? And they're wicked smart. You should read stories about like all the crazy things that octopus do in zoos. There's some evidence to indicate that like there's octopus kept in zoos and they could leave anytime they want. They just like the free food and like the predators. They also have these things called chromatophores, and like Google octopus camouflage, cuttlefish camouflage, and just look at these chromatophores. There's a video link there that kind of shows the shimmering nature, and it's wicked cool. I highly recommend you take a look. All right. So one thing that the mollusks lack is segmentation, right? So their body is typically just like one big unit. The next group, we're going to start seeing the development of segmentation, right? So the first annelida, what you would call earthworms, you can see all these different rings. These are different segments, okay? So segmentation is a big development, largely because it allows specialization of different regions, right? So each little region right here has its own respiratory system, and it has its own circulatory system, its own little collection of nervous system, right? And that allows each little specific region to do one specific thing. So like here's their reproductive region, you know, they have the nephridia here, crop, gizzard. So as they're processing this food, it'll go through the different segments, and the different segments have different structures and different organs that, you know, help it survive and reproduce, okay? They have a closed circulatory system, which is actually kind of a new development. So their blood isn't like just washing over their organs in an open cavity. Yeah, so they have a complete digestive system that goes all the way through with different specialization as it moves along. No respiratory system, which is a little bit unique, but yeah. Next group we're going to talk about is Nematoda. Nematoda is they have segmentation, although it's not as apparent as in this segment in worms. What's interesting is that they're a pseudocoelomate, so they lost their true coelomate, or it evolved independently, one of the two. They have a very complex digestive tract and a very complex life history. Most of them are parasites, but not all of them are parasites. They have a tough outer coating, unlike the segmented worms, so they're more hardy and they're more robust and they're able to survive in more environments. Earthworms are very sensitive to their environment, so like if you put poison in the ground in an earthworm, they just kind of like pull it up, right? Yeah. Most of them have separate males and female sexes, but some of them can reproduce asexually. C. elegans is actually a nematode. I think this is C. elegans right here, which is a very, very common research organism. They're very closely related to Arthropoda. Arthropoda is by far the most diverse phylum of animals, right? So like, if I remember correctly, there are more insect species than all the rest of the animal species combined, right? So they are like huge. There's something like 10,000 species of beetles, and beetles is just a genus, right? So like even at the genus level, very, very small. The defining characteristic of this group of organisms is that they have a hard exoskeleton with paired appendages, right? Sorry, excuse me. So the head has 2 antennae, right? Thorax has 2 legs. There's an and the abdomen. Well, the thorax actually has 4 legs, and then the abdomen has 2 more legs. So there's pairs of appendages. So if you see them on one side, you'll see it on the other side. So there is segmentation. So each one of these three segments has a paired appendage. High degree of cephalization. They have a brain, primitive brain, but they have a brain. Interestingly enough, they don't have a respiratory system. They have what's known as a tracheal system, which allows them to get bigger than other organisms, but it definitely limits their size, right? So like, that's the reason why you don't see like insects that are the size of like a Volkswagen Beetle, right? The respiratory system, the tracheal system just isn't as efficient as like a true respiratory system. And they actually have an open circulatory system as well, which is weird that, so that means the closed circulatory system either developed independently in the segmented worms or it was lost in the insects for whatever reason. Their exoskeleton is composed of chitin. Yeah. The exoskeleton is super important. It's a super important evolutionary development because it is really strong and really productive. The downside that an exoskeleton has over an endoskeleton is that they have to molt at various points in time in their life. Like they'll grow, and they'll get so big that they can't grow any bigger because of their exoskeleton. So they have to shed it and produce a new one, which leaves them vulnerable until a new exoskeleton appears. But this also gives them the opportunity to have distinct life stages. So this is why a lot of insects have like a defined larval, pupa, adult life stage, right? Or yeah, like that. And this can actually help reduce competition. So for instance, caterpillars and butterflies. The caterpillar and the butterfly are not utilizing the same resources, so they reduce competition amongst themselves, which is pretty cool. Super, super diverse group. All these organisms are different species of arthropods. Actually, these are all chelicerates. So Chelicerata is a spider group. Spiders, ticks, scorpions, spiders, ticks, scorpions, and horseshoe crabs, apparently. I actually didn't know that. They're marked by having four sets of paired appendages, right? So you can see all these have four sets of paired appendages. In the scorpions, they've been modified to be pincers, but they do still have the same number. This is a very primitive spider, apparently. Yeah. Oh, and they only have two segments, a head and a thorax. That's one other thing that defines spiders. The next group is Myriapoda, which is the millipedes and centipedes. The differences between them is millipedes have 2 pairs of legs per segment and are herbivorous, right? So this is a millipede right here, they're herbivorous. And centipedes have 1 pair of legs per segment and are carnivorous. Okay. Oh, and also, yeah, that's it. Hexapoda. This is the most species group within the arthropods. This is most of them right there. And like, the thing that makes them is that they have 6 pairs of appendages, right? And they're just a huge group, right? Like beetles and stink bugs and ants. I can't even begin to talk about all of them. One of the most important things to develop is wings. So they're the only arthropods with this adaptation, which, like, thank God there's no flying spiders. Okay, and the last group is the crustaceans. Crustaceans are crabs, shrimp, stuff like that, and then also isopods. Isopods are technically crustaceans. They're just crustaceans that develop on land, which is interesting, right? So the last 2 groups that we're going to talk about are what are known as the deuterostomes. So the difference between a protostome and a deuterostome, as I said previously, is a developmental distinction. The blastula forms, and the first invagination becomes the anus in deuterostomes. Prior to being, like in protozomes, it becomes a mouth. There's also some different, like the arrangement at the HL stage. so on and so forth. There's only two phylum of deuterostomes, Echinodermata and Chordata. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Echinodermata. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about Chordata because Chordata is the vertebrates. Okay. Echinodermata is sea stars and cucumbers. What's interesting about them is that they reverted to radial symmetry. They are still coelamitts. Yeah. But their coelom is modified to have a water vascular system that helps them move around. They move around very, very slowly. The fact that they have radial symmetry is really strange. Like there's little to no cephalization going on in Echinodermata. And you look at these things and say they have no similarity to vertebrates in any way, shape, or form. But oftentimes the juvenile form has bilateral symmetry and has cephalization, and it moves around and seeks an environment that is going to be good for it, right? And so it's thought that vertebrates evolved from a juvenile that retained its status. It just never really developed into an adult. Interestingly enough, they also cannot osmoregulate, so they have to live in fresh water. And everything occurs via diffusion. Yeah, they're really strange. Okay, so now we're on to the chordates. It's important to remember that all vertebrates are chordates, but not all chordates. Not all chordates are vertebrates, right? There are two groups that are not vertebrates. So a vertebrate is distinct from a chordate, but it's kind of a nesting thing, and everything is a nesting thing when we get into this. There are four major characteristics of chordates. The first of which is what's known as a notochord, which is a flexible cord that sits between the nervous system and the digestive system. And this is utilized for muscle attachment and also provides rigidity that allows for mobility. Actually, I should probably point out the notochord, all these things are evident in developing humans, and then they're replaced by other structures. So the notochord is replaced by the vertebrate system. So like a notochord is like the predecessor to it. You still have your dorsal nerve cord. That's what's known as your spinal cord, right? So like, so in a lot of the other organisms, there's like bilateral ganglia that run up their body plan. In chordates, they have a dorsal nerve cord. Pharyngeal slits are usually used for gas exchange. In humans, they fuse shut, and most people can't see them, but they're still there in like sharks and fishes and organisms like that. And then last but not least, the postanal tail. In a lot of organisms, the postanal tail is recessed. So like humans typically aren't born with tails, although it does happen on occasion. Okay. So I just really want to give you an idea of like the groupings of all these organisms, and you don't have to remember all this stuff, but these are a lot of the groups that we're going to talk about, but not all of them, okay? So all the previous groups we talked about were phylum, and chordate is a phylum as well. You have infraphylums, which are right below a phylum, and then a subphylum is typically a subdivision of an infraphylum, okay? Most of the organisms we're going to talk about are classes, right? So like these are all the different classes of vertebrates. Fish, amphibian, reptile, bird, mammal, okay? So that's the basic structure. At the phylogenetic grouping, you can do this circle thing where like you have chordates, and inside of that are the vertebrata. Most of them have mouth, right? Gnathostomata, okay? Most of those have bones, except for the chondrichthyes, right? And this group that we're not going to talk about. Sarcopterygidae, right? So here is the Actinopterygidae, which is the bony fishes, okay? Amniota. Here are lizards and their buddies, including aves, right there. And then you guys are over here in this group inside of what's known as Synapsidae, which is actually our sister clade, right? So here's a different one. So here we're going to talk about gnathostomates, Osteichthyes, Sarcopterygidae, Tetrapoda, Amniota, right? So broadly, this groups down into mammals, reptiles and birds, amphibians, And then you have a couple different types of fishes. And then over here is what's known as agnatha, which means without a mouth. Okay, so that's like the general breakdown. So now we're going to zoom back out, and I'm going to talk about like the broadest group of chordates, which is there's three main divisions, right? Cephalochordate, what's the other one called? Tunicates, and then vertebrates. Okay, so cephalochordae are what known as lancelets. They're marine organisms, and they look a lot like, you know, that primitive early chordate that you saw, right? And like they kind of look like that. They look like a little blade type thing. They have the pharyngeal gill slits. You can see the notochord. You can see kind of the different structures that it has, and these are basically filter feeders. And so they live in, they kind of push themselves into the sand or the dirt at the bottom, and they kind of filter stuff out. Okay. Tunicates are really strange. Tunicates are really strange, and they're known as sea squirts, right? So they look like a sponge. Okay. But they have a more complicated body plan, right? So they have the siphon, and they have a digestive tract, a stomach, all this different stuff going on. And so they're definitely more complicated than a sponge is, but they're actually more like a vertebrate, right? And it's thought that all the rest of the vertebrates evolved from the larval form that just never really developed into the adult form, right? Okay, so the next group we're going to talk about is the vertebrates, which is what you're familiar with. So the distinguishing characteristic of vertebrates is that they have a vertebrae, right? So they have a vertebral column, they have a cranium, and they have an endoskeleton, okay? Highly developed internal organisms, highly diverse body plans, very complicated set of Hox genes. So most other organisms only had one cluster of Hox genes. Humans have like 4 clusters of Hox genes, okay? So it's much more complicated body plans. Oh, and they also have highly developed internal structures. The kidneys are highly efficient, which is a modification that's required for living on land. And they have a liver, one of the only organisms that have livers. Okay, so there's a group of fishes. They're oftentimes called agnatha or cyclostomata, which means circular mouth. Okay, there's 2 groups of them. The first of which are what are known as hagfish, which is this thing in the lower right-hand corner. So they have vertebrae, right? But they've regressed to kind of like this eel-like state. Hagfish are really, really, really interesting. They're really ugly, and they have a mouth that's similar to this is a lamprey mouth, right? So they have a similar mouth to this too. But one of the cool things about them is that they produce like this really, really slippery slime, and so that's their defense mechanism. So like if a shark grabs one of these things, it'll start producing this slime, and it's actually so viscous and so sticky that it can actually clog gills and kill sharks. So like a lot of organisms don't mess with them because the slime is so weird. This is an image that was taken from the Pacific Northwest, I think Washington, and you can see there's a couple of hagfish down here. And what happened was these are a delicacy somewhere else in the world, so they harvest them in the Pacific Northwest, ship them away. But there was an accident. There was a car accident, and all these hagfish got spilled over the side of the road, and like it created snow-like conditions because it was raining outside the Pacific Northwest. So you can Google, if you Google hagfish car accident, you'll see images of all, like this road is completely covered with slime because a truck full of hagfish had an accident. And if you go to this video right here, I'm going to show it in class, but it's super cool. It shows how cool this slime really is. Lamprey are kind of the really, really gross alien looking things. Like that looks like something out of an alien. But basically what they do is they attach onto big fish and they just kind of like rasp open and kind of drink the blood. So they're kind of a parasitic life form. Okay, the gnathostomes. So gnathostomes are the jawed vertebrates. So everything from here on out has jaws, okay? And so they appeared about 470 million years ago, Okay, and the jaw evolved from modified gill arches, and like jaws are a huge evolutionary advantage because it allows you to better grasp and manipulate prey. The joke is, if you're a jawed fish, what do you call everything else? And the answer is food, right? Because you can eat so much better. So there's three main groups. Chondrichthyes, which is the sharks, Actinopterygii, which is the ray fin fishes, like the fish you typically think of, and then Sarcopterygii, which are the lobe fin fishes, which are fish that you typically wouldn't think of. So chondrichthyes are probably one of the coolest phylum of fishes out there. It's sharks, skates, rays, and chimeras are weird-looking sharks. They're really they haven't changed a lot in evolutionary history. They're really well adapted for their organization or their environment. They have a cartilaginous skeleton, which is likely, it's likely that their ancestors had a bony skeleton, but they just stopped making it. Like it's a reversion to an ancestral form in some ways. Or it's like it's a loss of function. Like they just stopped producing a hard skeleton and stuck with a cartilaginous skeleton for various different reasons. They're isotonic to their environment, which is really strange, which means they don't have to osmoregulate, right? Like they're not gaining or losing any water or ions, okay? But that also means that they can't be found in fresh water. They're denser than water, so if they're not moving forward, they will sink. So that's why a shark has to keep swimming, okay? The other thing about it is most of them, not all of them, they lack what's known as an operculum. So operculum is a gill covering, and so the flapping of the operculum can actually ventilate the gills, which is why bass and muskie and stuff like that can just kind of sit in the water, flap their gills, and keep breathing. A lot of sharks can't do that. They have to keep going because if they stop moving forward, water stops moving over their gills, and then they die. They suffocate. So they're really cool. They have separate male and female sexes, and they actually exhibit internal fertilization, which is a little strange because not many fish exhibit internal fertilization. But you can see these are claspers that are found on males, and then this is a female at right, so you can see the differences between them. So males and females are distinct, and they have this very easy to identify difference. This image right here is actually a close-up of their scales. If you ever get a chance to touch a shark, do it. Like they feel really cool. They're super smooth in one direction and like super rough in the other direction. But their scales actually become their teeth as they move. Like their skin is constantly moving towards their mouth. And as the scales get close to the mouth, they enlarge and develop into their teeth. So they have a never-ending supply of teeth, which is really cool. Sharks are cool, man. Oh, they also have a lateral line system, which detects pressure changes in organisms really readily. And it was a precursor to our ear. And they have something called the ampullae of Lorenzini, which can detect electrical signals on fish that are close by, which is really also cool. That's it. All right, the next group is what's known as Actinopterygii. So they are the ray fin fishes. There's about 32,000 species. This is one of the largest groups of vertebrates in the world. Like I said, they have the operculum that allows them to move water over their gills. And the defining characteristics is that their fins are supported by rays. And so like here is a sailfish, and you can see all the rays. This is my nephew, who is also a vertebrate, but he is not a fish. Here he is holding a fish, though. This is a dogfish, or a bowfin, if I remember correctly. And then this is like a muskie, and you can see the rays coming out of them. They're pokey rays. Some fish actually have lungs, and some fish can actually breathe air. Sometimes the lungs have been modified into a swim bladder. Sometimes they haven't. It just depends on the origin of the species and how much it's evolved. Sarcopterygii are the lobe fin fishes. To the best of our knowledge, there's only one species, but we thought they were extinct. So I mean, like there could be more. And the ocean is a really big place. Okay, so you can see their lobes are not they're softer and more malleable. A lot of these walk along the ocean bottom, Um, and so this group was a very, very successful group of organisms back in the Denisovian, but most of them died off in the Mesozoic area. And like this is what tetrapods evolved from, right? So um, to start out, land was colonized by plants and other animals first. So vertebrates were kind of late to the scene to arrive. But they kind of invaded these shallow water pools, which were rich in nutrients but poor in oxygen, which encouraged lung development, right? And the shallow water includes like limb development, so they can move around these shallow freshwater pools. Eventually, they just started moving onto land once they could start utilizing it, and then utilizing that ecosystem because the land was a really rich ecosystem as well, and it was ripe for invasion. And you can still see the ancestral form. If you look at the Hox genes characteristics that changed over time, you can see how fish like Actinopterygidae and Sarcopterygidae have slightly different Hox genes than like tetrapods. So the first group of tetrapods are amphibians, and these were the first fully land organisms. They're always tethered to water in that they require water for reproduction. So their eggs will dry out if they leave them on land. And a lot of times their skin will dry out too. So they're very dependent on being near water, but they spend most of their life on land. They were the dominant, like they were a very, very diverse group, like 260 million years ago. But something happened and they lost like 90 to 95% of their species. So there was a mass extinction. They're currently undergoing another mass extinction right now, but that's largely human driven. There's only 8,450 species, and that's declining rapidly. They usually have external reproduction, and it almost always has to be laid in water, except for salamanders who will lay theirs in like moist environment. Their juveniles are typically fish-like, and then they turn into adults. One major evolutionary development is they have a two-way, a dual-track system, a dual-track circulatory system. So what that means is there is a pulmonary circuit and there's a systemic circuit, which you'll be familiar with. That's what humans have, right? Fishes have a two-chambered heart with a one-way system, right? Like there's no dual circuit, right? It's just a single loop that goes around. And we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. But they have a three-chambered heart, so there's mixture of deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood, so they're always sending like half oxygenated blood. So all the rest of the organisms are what are known as amniotes. And the big evolutionary development is the amniotic egg. And the amniotic egg is desiccation resistant. Like it doesn't dry out if you lay it on land, which is important, which means like now these organisms can fully invade land and fully take advantage of land and fully utilize land. They also developed a waterproof skin, right? And then what's known as negative pressure breathing. So you'll remember from anatomy and physiology, right? You have a diaphragm, okay? And when the diaphragm contracts, it expands the volume of the thoracic cavity, which creates a negative pressure and draws air in the lungs. Amphibians use a positive pressure system wherein they kind of like force air into their lungs by using like a buccal area. And so this is just a negative breathing system is much more energy efficient because all you have to do is expand the volume of your thoracic cavity and air flows in because it reduces the pressure. Whereas with a positive pressure system, you have to like force the air in. So this was a much more efficient mechanism. And here you can see the different circulatory systems, right? So in the fish, you have this one-way system, right? Where there's a two-chambered heart that pumps the blood to the gills send it to the systemic vesicles, and then returns to the heart. And so it's just this one track going back and forth. Amphibians have this dual track where you have a separated pulmonary and systemic circuit. This separation allows for higher pressure at both locations, right? Because if you go through one capillary bed and then you go through another capillary bed, the pressure when it gets down here is pretty low. But here, it's only ever going, it like goes through the capillary bed, comes back to the heart, gets repressurized, and then gets sent out to a new capillary bed, and then comes back to the heart. So this is a higher pressure, which is more energy. It's a more efficient exchange of gas. What you start to see in reptiles actually is a further division of this chamber into two separate chambers, right? So a lot of reptiles have a 3.5 chambered heart, and crocodilians have a 4-chambered heart. And then both birds and mammals have a 4-chambered heart, okay, where there is no mixture of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, which just makes the entire system more energy efficient. Because then you're not sending this half oxygenated blood like amphibians do. So that was a big evolutionary development too. Okay, yeah. So we're going to talk about reptiles next. There's a couple major groups within reptiles. Testudinae, which is the turtles and terrapins and stuff like that. Squamata, which is the lizards and snakes. The crocodilians. The dinosaurs, which is actually 2 subgroupings of dinosaurs, but we don't get into that. And then last but not least, aves, which is the birds. So it's important to remember that birds are actually reptiles. They're grouped with the reptile clade, and they have more in common with reptiles than they do with mammals. These are fully terrestrial species. They can lay their eggs on land. They do not need to return to the land. Although some of them are marine, like there's obviously crocodiles are obviously aquatic or marine, and sea turtles are aquatic and marine. Pretty big group. There's about 10,000 species, not including the birds. Birds are cool. Birds are a subgroup of species, or a subgroup of reptiles. They're nested within that group. They have about 9 to 10,000 species of their own. They are most closely related to dinosaurs, and birds have some very, very, very unique developments. The first of which is they have feathers, which are modified scales. It's like the dinosaurs also had feathers. But they serve 2 major functions. They help maintain heat in cooler climates, and then they generate airfoil. They have a really, really efficient respiratory system in which they have air sacs. And this is really important because it allows complete ventilation of their lungs, right? So like you utilize what's known as tidal ventilation, wherein you move the air in and out of your lungs from the same pathway. But what happens with birds is they have a series of air sacs inside their body, and when they breathe, it moves it from one air sac to another air sac to another air sac over the lungs. So there's never a mixture of deoxygenated air and oxygenated air, which means that their respiratory system is much more efficient than ours. They have to be, because flight is very energetically expensive. Another major flight is very important to birds. A lot of them fly, and that has been a huge evolutionary development for them. But it also, one of the constraints of flight is that they have a tendency to reduce their weight, right? Most of them only have one ovary. They usually don't have a bladder. They usually don't have teeth, and their bones are very, very light and very frail. They also have a tendency to have most of their muscle mass on their ventral surface, like their stomach, and that's to help maintain stability during flight. They also have very good vision, typically. Mammals. Mammals is a very diverse group. There's lots of different adaptations. There's about 5,000 some odd species of mammals. This is actually the image from Wikipedia for mammals, and I love that they just have like Richard Nixon right in the middle as a representative human. For whatever reason, somebody thought Richard Nixon was a very representative human. The defining characteristics of mammals is we have big skulls. Our teeth are highly specialized to be incisors. We have hair, and then, of course, mammary glands, which produce milk. There are 3 major groups of mammals: the monotremes, which is the duckbill platypus, echidna, and then there's a shrew. Marsupials, kangaroo, and stuff like that are typically found in Australia, and then the vast majority are placental mammals. And placental mammals are the most successful group of organisms. We're going to start moving through the mammals a little bit and start breaking them down. Don't worry about any of these groups, but these are the three major groupings of organisms within the mammal clade, right? So armadillos, elephants, otters, shrews, tree shrews, primates, dogs, rabbits, rodents. So we're in this group right here, and then you have your hedgehogs, whales, bats, dogs, cats. Actually, this one might be wrong. I was under the impression that whales and elephants are closely related, but I could be wrong. No, never mind. That's right. All right, but it doesn't matter too much anyways. We're interested in this group right here, which is known as the primates. Okay. Um, Primates are defined, they have a grasping hand. They're typically herbivorous, frugivorous, or omnivores. By the way, we are now getting into information. This is all in the book. So this is not stuff that's external anymore. This is relevant to you guys right now, and it comes from the text. Another reduced sense of smell, but a greater development of visual. Primates have a tendency to be very, very visual creatures. There's three major groups: prosimians, New World monkeys, and Old World monkeys. We're specifically interested in the Old World monkey group because that's where the apes are, and humans are a type of ape. So here's the prosimians, tarsiers and lemurs. You have the New World monkeys, which are found in South America, Old World monkeys, okay? And then the hominids includes gibbons, orangutan, gorillas, and chimpanzees, right? And then humans. Breaking it down a little bit further, from hominidae, you have hominae, which includes pongo is I think that's the orangutans. Hominae includes the gorillas. Homini is humans and chimpanzees, and then we are in the group Homo. Okay, so we are most interested in the group Homo. We split off from chimpanzees and bonobos about 7 to 10 million years ago. Okay, the first grouping prior to Homo, there was a group called Australopithecus, which is there's Ardipithecus and Australopithecines. This is the more ancestral group, about 6 to 4 million years ago, and it represents a sister clade to us that is now extinct. Australopithecines evolved about 4 to 1 million years ago. They were the first organisms that were truly fully bipedal, and they utilized tools, which, yes, that is supposed to say tools, not tools. Lucy, the famous skeleton Lucy, is an example. Lucy wasn't a very big skeleton, but from the fragments we have been able to recover, we've been able to make an approximation of her reconstruction with some minor details. And it's fairly evident. You can see the pattern in her legs. It looks like she was fully bipedal, even though she was a relatively small organism overall. So these were the first bipedal organisms. Moving on into the Homo group. So we were talking about Australopithecines up here, right? These are the Australopithecus organisms up here. They gave rise to a species known as Homo habilis. Homo habilis existed about 2.3 to 1.65 million years ago. Cranium size becomes a very important distinction characteristic in the Homo group because there is this trend of increasing cranium size. And Homo habilis, sorry if it sounded like a cutout, I had to sneeze. Homo habilis had a cranium size of about 600 cc's. Homo habilis is also called Homo ergaster, but we are not going to, the book doesn't really talk about that. Okay. Homo erectus existed between 2 million years and about 100,000 years ago. Slightly larger cranium, about 880 cc cranium, so it's getting slightly larger, and they were actually able to migrate all the way up to Europe. The most, the common ancestor between humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovians is Homo heidelbergensis. Okay, they exist from 600 to 300 thousand BCE. Okay, That's supposed to be 600 to 300,000 BCE. So they were actually slightly contemporary to Homo erectus, right? They had a 12, their cranium was about a 1250 cc's, which is very similar to size of modern humans. Moving on, there are three groups that derive from Homo heidelbergus. The Homo denisova, we don't really know a lot about these organisms. We've only been able to find about six fossils. We know they have features that are distinct from Neanderthals and features that are distinct from Homo sapiens. It is possible that they were able to interbreed with modern humans, but I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. The book doesn't mention it. I read an article that said it's possible, if not probable. We do know a lot about Homo neanderthalis. The Neanderthals, we found a lot. We have many, many, many fossils of them. We know a lot about their anatomy, about their physiology. We know a lot about their genetics. They were contemporary to modern humans. So they existed from 300,000 to 25,000 years before the current era. And modern humans showed up about 200,000 years ago. So they were a very closely related group of organisms to us and very similar. There is very strong evidence that they interbred with humans. And there are people who have Neanderthal DNA. There's a higher percentage of Neanderthal DNA in people who are from Europe, but you can also find Neanderthal DNA in other people from other different areas too. It's very likely they had culture and art. It has been demonstrated that they had ritualized burials, and it's even possible that they did ritualistic cannibalism. One thing that's very interesting about Neanderthals is that they actually have a larger cranium than modern humans do. So their cranium size is about 1,500 cc's, and our cranium is about 1,350 cc's. So they actually had a larger brain. They're about the same size as us, so it's not that they had more motor neurons or more anything like that, like they needed a larger brain. They just had a bigger cranium capacity than us. For whatever reason, we outcompeted them, and we basically drove them to extinction. What it was about us that caused us to drive them to extinction is, I don't know. There's a lot of speculation on that, and we'll talk a little bit about it later, but it's an interesting question. Yeah. All right, so some of the features that make humans unique. The first of which is what's known as bipedalism. Dr. Urhat, I believe, came in and I'm recording this before the semester, so I don't know if Dr. Urhat has come in to talk to us yet. But he's going to talk about bipedalism extensively, so I'm not really going to dive into it. There's a lot of different theories for why bipedalism developed in humans. There's a lot of different, it has a lot of advantages, particularly that it's a very efficient mechanism of moving about, but there's also a lot of costs, right? And so one of the major costs is the narrowing of the birth canal, which severely limits how big of a head can fit through there, which has affected our development in very interesting ways. So this bipedalism is something that's going to come up again and again and again. There is a general trend in humans for increasing body size. Neanderthals were probably slightly larger than us, but not too much larger than us. But going from, chimpanzees were very small, Lucy was very small, but they developed larger and larger and larger. So that's an evolutionary pressure that we've been experiencing. The book puts forth a theory of increased predation could have resulted in larger body size, but like, you're talking about the African savannah, like a lion and a hyena is going to eat a human for lunch no matter what. So I just don't find that to be a very compelling reason, but it's possible. What is known is that the increased size leads to increased metabolic demands, which likely pushed humans to develop larger ranges. Okay. If you have large metabolic demands, those are your two options. You either increase your range or you eat more food with low calorie, like a gorilla. We're going to talk a little bit more about how eating more food that's lower in nutrition is problematic, but we'll get there. Broadly speaking, humans have a very flat face. So when you compare it to a chimpanzee, they have kind of this protruding mouth and protruding brow ridges. And even compared to Neanderthals, they had more of a protruding jaw and a pronounced brow ridge, right? So there's a couple things driving this. So we have less developed masseter muscles when compared to like chimpanzees, but part of that could be a reflection of our diet, which has more meat in it. Also, our incisors are generally less sharp and more for grinding, which further reflected our change. Sorry, my dog is drinking water again. Um, Grinding, which it also reflected our change to a more omnivorous diet. And this was likely, fire actually probably helped drive this as well, because it just makes the meat more tender and easier to use. One of the interesting things is our GI tract is quite a bit smaller than a lot of the other primates. And so this is a graph of cranial capacity over body weight overall. And you can see we have a really big head, okay? But you can kind of see groupings with different organisms, right? And so here are the monkeys and apes specifically, and we're sitting way above this curve. If you look at gorillas, they have this really, really, really big protruding belly, and so do chimpanzees, where we have very, very small GI tracts, right? So a specific example of this is our appendix is a leftover of a lot of our ancestors that eat more herbivorous diets have a larger cecum, which is helpful to digest food. But we don't get enough energy out of like eating grasses and stuff like that for it to really be worth our time. And this is, I mean, like, anytime you see a deviation like this, you should try to explain it somewhat, okay? So there's definitely been a shift in primates from herbivorous to frugivore. And a lot of gorillas and chimpanzees are more frugivore than they are herbivorous. So this has been an evolutionary shift. And then humans went further and they're more omnivorous in that they eat a lot of meat. The hypothesis that explains this, and it's unfortunately not a hypothesis that's easy to test, is what's known as the expensive tissue hypothesis. So neuronal tissue is very energetically efficient. So if you think back to physiology, neuronal tissue functions by the movement of ions in and out and back and forth, which means you need a lot of sodium potassium pumps to power them. And so they're just very, very energetically expensive. A really good example is your brain is about 2% of your body mass, but it consumes about 20% of your energy, okay? And interesting enough, I found out that playing chess burns about 276 calories per hour, which is a 10% increase over basal rate. Like you're just sitting there, but you have a 10% increase in basal rate because you're thinking. So studying likely has a 10% increase in basal rate too because you're firing neurons a lot. To put that in perspective, running for 1 hour burns about 720 calories. So it's not a huge energetic increase, but it definitely shows that like using your brain takes a lot of energy. And so you have this tension, right? Where like, if you are developing more and more neurons, that means your energy expenditure has to get higher, or like your energy intake has to get higher and higher and higher, okay? And so that either means you have to eat more food, which requires larger range, more food sources, so on and so forth, or you can get rid of tissues that you don't need. And so a more meat-based diet, meat is easier to digest because it's just easier to break down because it's closer to what you're going to make it into anyways. It requires less GI tract to break down meat than it does to break down fruit or vegetables, right? And so the idea is because of all the neurons that we had to develop, it's possible that we sacrificed our GI tract in order to continue to grow our neurons, our brain. It's also possible that one of the reasons why we outcompeted Neanderthals is that they had too much nervous tissue, and it actually, the cost of the neurons outweighed the benefits. And they just required much higher food sources, and so they weren't able to compete with us, which is really, really, really interesting. I find that fascinating personally. This is also the expensive tissue hypothesis is hotly debated. It's not like there's a consensus out there, but it is a very compelling theory at this point. The unfortunate reality of the situation is that it's not testable, and there's not much you can do about that. Hey, this slide right here, it shows, what we observe in terms of gut size versus what would be expected. And you can see that the gut is much smaller and the brain is much larger than expected. The source of this is from the University of Georgetown. So it is academic, but it wasn't a nutrition department, not like an evolutionary department or an anthropology department or anything like that. So I'm not 100% sure of their methods, but there have been other agencies that have shown this before. So another thing that's unique amongst humans is that we don't have hair. This is a gorilla that was born hairless through a genetic condition. I just wanted to show you this because it shows that it's very likely that the original skin color was actually pretty pale. And then because we're in Africa, MC1R underwent selective pressure, which MC1R is one of the genes that controls melanin production. And so I don't remember exactly how MC1R works, but that's likely what caused us to develop a darker skin color, right? The reason why we have so little hair is hotly debated. Some people think it has to do with thermoregulation. There is a hypothesis called the aquatic ape hypothesis, which it's kind of losing steam because it doesn't really explain things very well. But it hypothesizes that early hominins were actually semi-aquatic, and that's why they lost their hair, because it helped with movement through the water, right? I don't find that theory very elegant because it also ties into bipedalism and well, I don't know. I mean, Lucy could have been, yeah, I suppose. I really don't know. But that's something that people have talked about. Sexual selection is, for me, a really compelling answer. And there's a couple different reasons. First off, it's a very, very rapid evolutionary change. We diverged away from chimpanzees about 7 million years ago, and we're almost completely hairless, right? And so sexual selection makes a lot of sense. The other reason why I think sexual selection is appealing is because body hair and facial hair is a secondary sexual characteristic. So like during puberty, axillary hair begins to develop, pubic hair begins to develop, beards begin to develop, right? And so to me, that those two things paired together make it seem like that's a very likely thing, that it was undergoing sexual selection. What that means for modern day humans in terms of like hair preference, I don't know. It gets really complicated because of culture is a very important aspect on beauty standards and all that stuff, and it really muddles things up. But sexual selection seems like a very compelling theory. If you're interested, this book over here at the right, Desmond Morris, it's called The Naked Ape. I read it. It was a fascinating book. It was written in the 1970s, and it's the attempt of this guy, Desmond Morris. He's an anthropologist, and he's trying to look at humans as if an alien would look at humans, right, and describe our social behaviors from like an anthropological point of view. It's really interesting. A lot of the science is outdated at this point in time because it was written in the 70s, and we just like genetics, and think about all those different things. But it is interesting to look at the human condition as if you were not a human. So if you're interested in reading this book, I would recommend it, but just be aware that a lot of the theories are no longer supported. All right. Human brain size is obviously something that is like really defines humans, right? So like, you can see even amongst like closely related organisms, like the great apes, and australopithecines. If you graph um, body size and brain size, you see Homo sapiens are way up here, right? And Neanderthals would actually be up here too. So there's this thing called an encephalization quotient. I can't remember the exact formula for it. But it's basically a measure of brain size. It's a way of standardizing it. And you see chimps at about a 2, australopithecines at about a 2.5, and then you get in the Homo group and it's 3.3, and humans are way up here at 5.8. And they've actually found some very, very interesting genes that have been that are likely driving this, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. But why we have our big brains is definitely something that you have to keep in mind. And you have to think about it. You have to explain, like, what is the adaptive value of having a big brain, particularly when they are so energetically expensive? And is that a continuing selective pressure, right? Like, is human brain size expected to continue to grow, or is there a limiting point in time where it actually becomes maladaptive to have larger brain size? Not necessarily smarter, because brain size and smartness are not necessarily the same thing, but there's definitely a correlation going on there. Like, is there an optimum, and are we past it? Which is basically the plot of the movie Idiocracy, which is interesting. And it's also important to keep in mind Neanderthals had a larger brain than humans. So it's not self-evident that a larger brain is always better, right? Like, we could be past the optimum, or we could be at the optimum, or we could be below it. And I guess time will tell. You could also just look around at the world today and realize that we're smart enough to cause ourselves to go extinct. And whether we do or not, we certainly have the potential to do so. Previous couple slides have basically been going through and talking about, what are the costs of having a large brain. And as we said, there are significant costs in terms of like complicating the birth, as well as just like the energy. So if these big brains have been developing, then there must be some adaptive value, right? And so, obviously making tools and stuff like that is an adaptive value that most people think of, but a lot of people argued that it was the social aspects. So if you look across the animal kingdom, grooming is very important for like chimpanzees in maintaining social hierarchies and order, and like what monkey grooms what monkey in what order and how often helps reinforce their social bonds. But you really don't see that with humans. It's more of just like spending time, right? And so a lot of it is like talking to each other and communicating and social interactions broadly. And having similar social interactions are kind of what helps maintain our social order. So keeping track of all these different relationships is very complicated. There's an interesting thing, it's a mathematical principle, but basically like as you add relationships, the number of possible relationships and interactions increases, right? Because you have two people, right? There's two relationships. My relationship to person A, or person's A relationship to person B, and person's B to person A. If you add a third person, it's A to B, B to C, C to A, and then A to C. So there's like twice as many relationships. If you add a fourth person, you have A to B, A to C, A to D, B to A, B to C, B to D, C to, like you can kind of see it's increasing by the square. So like with the more people you add to a group, the more complicated it gets. And it seems like there's realistically a limit to the size of our social group, and it's generally about 150 individuals. Like those are the number of relationships that we're able to keep track of. But anyways, so one of the arguments is that a bigger brain, more social interactions, more social network, and that was one of the really important developments. This created what's known as an evolutionary ratchet, and then basically the idea is the increased social relationships increased reproductive fitness, but this created more complicated social relationships and a more complicated society, which required more complicated brains, right? So it's like ratcheting. The other thing is, if you're going to have a society, it's important to recognize that there will be cheaters in your society. And the prisoner's dilemma kind of shows that if you're going to have some sort of altruism, you also need to have some sort of repercussions for cheaters, right? And keeping track of that is important. In order to recognize cheaters, right, you have to have a certain order of intentionality, right? So there's this idea of awareness, right? So first order awareness is I know I'm aware, right? I know that I can think. Second order awareness is that I know I'm aware, but I'm also know that you are aware. So you are aware that other people are aware. And then third order thinking is aware that you are aware that I am aware, right? Fourth order allows you to predict like what will happen. So if I do this, this is what will happen. Fifth order, you start getting into like what you hope people do versus what they do. And sixth order, it gets a little complicated, and this is a little fuzzy in my mind. So mostly we're going to talk about like third and fourth order. But you have to have like fourth order awareness, I think it is, or third order awareness, right? You have to be aware that you are aware that I am aware for cheating to actually exist, right? Because like you have to be aware that by cheating this person out, it's going to cost them, cost social interactions with them, and you're okay with that. Like the cost is over the benefit. Anything bigger than that, or anything lower than that, and really you're just stealing resources. So yeah, this brain size also enabled cheating in society, whereas like with cats and stuff like that, they really don't have that, third or fourth level awareness that requires cheaters to exist. Tool making is obviously a very important aspect of having a big brain and like a big advantage of it, but also art and culture is very important. So we're going to talk about tools first, and then we'll talk a little bit more. We'll move into art because they're actually kind of connected a little bit. So there's other animals that use tools. Like humans aren't the only, even the primates aren't the only group of organisms that use tools. Like crows will use simple tools to do stuff. And the Darwin's finches, there's an example of a bird that uses a cactus spine in order to stab its prey. Octopus can use simple tools as well. So like we're not the only organisms, but we definitely use tools much more extensively. The first simple tools appeared about 2.5 million years ago. About 1.6 million years ago, you're seeing rounded tools, axes, and harpoons. And then it was pretty static for a really, really, really long time, until about 250,000 years ago. And then you start to see like this rapid expansion in the types of tools you saw. About 100,000 years ago, there was evidence of long distance exchange of goods. So like moving different types of iron or metals and wood and rocks and stuff like that around. So like a trading culture appeared. 50,000 years, humans arrived in Australia. This is important because it kind of gives you the idea of the colonization of Oceania. And, if you think about getting from Asia to Australia, you're going to have to cross some seas, right? And so like water levels were lower, but they weren't like so much so that we could walk all the way from Asia to Australia. Like there's literally an ocean between there. So this is showing, if humans arrived in Australia 50,000 years ago, they have the tools to be able to build boats that are able to navigate fairly extensive bodies of water. So the tools to build the boats, and then also the ability to at least somewhat navigate across these oceans. And about 40,000 years ago, humans replaced Neanderthals, and you start to see representative art in music. It's possible that Neanderthals also had representative art, possibly music, who knows. The book spends a little bit of time talking about communication in Neanderthals. It actually spends a lot of time talking about communication and vocalizations. Neanderthals had a larynx similar to modern humans, right? It talks about language as like a binary system, right? Like you either have language or you don't. But in reality, it's probably much more of a continuum. So like chimpanzees communicate vocally somewhat. So it's likely our species became more and more vocal with more and more complicated language over time. So I would assume that even the most primitive humans use some sort of vocalization, and a more vocal social interaction is probably something that differentiated us from primates very early on. And then our vocalization became more and more complicated until we have stuff like we have today, like hip hop and music and poetry and slam poetry and professors lecturing on and on, stuff like that. You start talking about language, the ability to communicate and to pass on information from generation to generation, and from group to group is one of the things that really makes humans different from a lot of other organisms. Sorry, my dog is drinking water again. Um, you really don't. Chimpanzees seem to have some sort of uh, culture in where they have, chimpanzees from the eastern part of Africa versus the western part of Africa have slightly different behaviors and mannerisms and stuff like that, but they don't have these complicated societies like we do. And a large part of forming a complicated society is this collection of knowledge that's passed amongst groups and then down through the generations, and this accumulation of knowledge. And this is coupled as well with writing. Once we were able to write stuff down and move from an oral tradition to a written tradition, we have much better record keeping and collection of data, right? Um, so the evolution of human society, this cartoon on the right, I think I linked to in the study guide. I think it's really interesting to think about that, like, a lot of the problems we have are aspects of culture, which is really kind of interesting. Okay, so early hominids were probably mobile groups of foragers that moved from area to area. And they basically would move wherever there was an advantage. Like, you just follow whatever resources there are, and if the resources run dry in a particular area, you move to a different area. Slowly, they started to kind of stay in one local area, right? So agriculture developed independently in multiple different areas. The earliest examples were about 12,000 years ago in like the Middle East area, but it also appeared like 5,000 years ago in the Americas and Southern Africa. Asia, it appeared about the same time it did in the Middle East, I believe. So there's multiple different independent origins of agriculture. There are some towns that actually predate agriculture, right? They've been able to find towns and settlements that are 13,000 years old, which is probably before there was agriculture. But if you think about an area that's just like really, really rich in game, it could probably support a decent sized settlement for many, many, many years. Or it's possible that these groups of humans had, a couple different settlements that they move back and forth between. Like, they hunt all the resources in one area for part of the year, and then they move to a different area to get different resources. And this transition, like almost like snowbirds. And it's unclear exactly how that works and how it developed, but agriculture has really profoundly changed us in a lot of different ways. It changed our diet from more of a foraging, a highly variable diet, to something that's much more, you have staples, right? Corn, rice, barley, wheat, stuff like that. You're eating much more of those cereals, right? The domestication of livestock, which followed the development of agriculture, allowed milk to be used more frequently and a more consistent supply of meat, right? So a less varied supply of meat, but a more consistent supply of meat. Having livestock also increased our exposure to diseases, which is interesting. If you think about a lot of our, like avian flu is something that comes from chickens. So the more animals you keep in livestock, the more chance there is, the closer exposure to humans, the more chance it is it jumps to humans. Incidentally, the increase in agriculture actually lead to an increased amount in famine. And this seems a little bit counterintuitive, and I actually balked at this. I was like, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. But if you think about it a little bit, right, if you are a nomadic group of people and there's a famine, you just go somewhere else. You just go where there's not a famine, right? And you might have lean times while you're traveling through an area, but ultimately you'll get to an area that is rich in food. If you're tied to an area and there's a famine, you have to decide to ride it out or leave, and if you have significant investment into that land, you might stay. The increase, the development of agriculture actually caused an increase in famine, something that we experienced. The other thing that agriculture brought about was the specialization, right? So if you have people who are specializing in raising livestock and specializing in raising grain, it would make sense for them to start to trade. Once you have traders, you have merchants, right? And it requires a monetary system. And then you can start to specialize in other things, like artists can trade their art for food and grain and stuff like that. And then once you have this kind of merchant class, agricultural class, artist class, you start to have some sort of organizational structure, and that leads to the development of the political and religious caste. And those two they are very closely linked throughout human history. They continue to be very closely linked today in a lot of different ways. And then, interestingly enough, the medical class arose from this religious class, right? So like, the earliest medicine was probably people asking for intervention from the gods to help this afflicted person. But then they started to find things. It's like, well, when this person shows these symptoms, if I give them this, they tend to get better. And this likely led to very primitive forms of medicine like herbalism. It's been known for something like, the ancient Greeks knew that if you had a headache, you chew on willow bark. And as it was found out, willow bark actually contains the active ingredient aspirin, which is a vasodilator, which oftentimes does help relieve pain, right? So it's very likely that the medical class actually arose from the religious class. If you look at the genetics of humans, there's a lot of interesting things going on. So it's basically pretty well known that we share something like 96 to 99% of our DNA with chimps, and that sounds like a huge amount of variability, but it depends on if you want to look at like different areas of the DNA, or if you're including or omitting various different areas of the DNA. We share a lot of our DNA with chimpanzees. Interestingly enough, humans have a different chromosome number than all the other primates. Our chromosome number 2 is likely resulted, right? Our chromosome number 2 is our second biggest chromosome. If you look at chimpanzees, they have 2 smaller chromosomes, and it's very likely that they fuse together at a certain point in time. And that's why we have a different chromosome number from all the other chimps. If you want to specific areas of interest are what are known as human accelerated regions, okay? And so basically what you're doing is you're looking at genes that have been stable over the evolution of mammalian evolution for many, many millennia, right? So there's very few changes across all animals. But in humans, there's very rapid acceleration, like lots of different changes. And the book called out a few of them specifically. So one is HACNS1, which has to do with the development of limb joints. Particularly, it helps contribute to our fully opposable thumb, and then also bipedalism, it's thought. SEMA, I don't know what that does. It's something to do with the terminal molecule in glycans, and I don't really get what that means. MYH16 is a myosin gene that had something to do with the reduction of our jaw size. The one that's most interesting to me is DUF1220. The number of copies of this gene varies across mammals. Okay, so mice have 1. Chimpanzees have about 150. Humans have 300. Okay, and it turns out the copy numbers actually correlates with brain size. This is a gene that specifically is responsible for something to do with neuronal development. So it's possible that this is a causal relationship, right? So like the increase in the numbers of DUF 1220 is what's driving the development of our brains. All right, so origins of humans. There appears to have been 2 major dispersals out of Africa. Homo erectus left Africa into southern Europe and Asia about 1 million years ago. The Homo erectus gave rise to Homo heidelbergensis, right, in Africa. Heidelbergensis then gave rise to Neanderthals, Denisovians, and Homo sapiens. There was a second dispersal of Heidelbergensis out of Africa, and then modern humans and Neanderthals arose from that. There used to be competing theories about the origins of humans. Did we evolve independently in multiple different locations, or was it one origin in Africa and then everybody came from that? And it seems like most of the evidence is pointing to there was one evolutionary event where humans appeared in Africa, and then we dispersed across the planet from there. It's very likely that the early dispersals from Africa arose from conflict. Population grew, resources became limited, different groups fought with each other, the losers had to leave, right? And that's basically what likely happened. There's evidence that the groups that left Africa were very, very small groups, like 40 to 50 individuals, right? The evidence for that is there are 40 to 50 different mitochondrial lineages in Africa, but only 2 from outside of Africa. So there's basically like all of the non-Africans arose from 2 women, possibly. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And then all the non-African Y chromosomes carry the same mutation. So it might have been a very, very small group. The first areas that our ancestors inhabited were Africa, Europe, and Asia. About 40,000 years ago, they were all well populated with humans. North America didn't see humans until about 14,000 years ago. And the last place, the group that moved to North America was also very likely a very small group, only about 70 people estimated. And then Oceania was probably the last area that was colonized. About 5,500 years ago was when we started to move into that area, so very, very recently. Humans occupy a wide range of climes, right? From the southern tip of South America all the way up to, the northernmost parts of Siberia are occupied by humans. So across that gradient, you see different characteristics of different humans, and this is what's given rise to the concept of race. So Bergman and Allen's rule, we talked about a little bit. Northern populations tend to be short and stocky. Warm climates more tall and thin, but there's considerable variability, right? Skin color is strongly geographically correlated with UV exposure, and also live high in the mountains, you tend to have darker skin color because there's more direct UV exposure as well. There's a wide variety of cold tolerance. Just because, my people are from Northern Europe, and we do not tolerate the heat very well, which is the reason why I left Oklahoma. But there are lots of people who can't tolerate Minnesota winters, and I get it, And then various different reasons result in various different cultures, particularly the independent origins of agriculture in different locations led to different staples in different areas. In Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, wheat and barley were the primary grains. In Asia, it was largely rice. In North America, it was largely also rice. And then in South America, it was yams. I believe it was yams. I'd have to look back at that. So there's that's something that developed independently. Another thing that's interesting, I found out that the Dakota people were one of the only groups of groups of humans that readapted to a nomadic lifestyle. So the people who came over to North America were likely settlement based, right? And then the Dakota people changed into a more nomadic lifestyle where they followed their primary food source around the buffalo, which is really, really interesting. Humans always ask the question, Are humans still evolving? And I get really annoyed by this question, and I see this a lot in like newspaper articles. Are humans still evolving? It's like, yeah, of course we are. Like, of course we're still evolving. Even if we're only undergoing genetic drift, we're still evolving, right? And we haven't removed all selective pressures, right? There's still differential survival and reproduction, okay? So a couple examples, the body still responds to malaria. There's two different adaptations to there's three different adaptations. But two that I'm most familiar with, sickle cell anemia is one that we've talked about previously, but there's also a condition called thalassemia, which is found more in Greece and the Middle East. It has a lot of similar characteristics to sickle cell anemia, but I feel like it's not quite as severe, but I'd have to look into it. But basically, the heterozygous state provides protection from malarial infection, but the homozygous state causes disease phenotypes. It's just there's more variability in how bad it is. So it's a little bit more complicated of a story. Another example of a gene is CCR5. So there is a mutation to the CCR5 gene called delta 32, if I remember correctly, which basically causes it to cease to function. Okay, so what CCR5 is there are CD4 is the receptor that a lot of different viruses bind to in order to attack the cell, particularly HIV, right? And CCR5 is the co-receptor. And so you have to have CCR5 in order for the virus to be able to invade the cell. Well, some people have a non-functional copy of CCR5 called delta 32. And so the virus can bind to the CD4 receptor, but it can't get inside the cell because it doesn't have that co-receptor, right? And so people who have this CCR5 delta 32 mutation have been shown to be completely resistant to HIV. And it's likely that this mutation actually arose from Black Death, the bubonic plague. And I remember in the very early days of the pandemic, people were talking about how the delta 32 mutation also conferred some advantage to COVID resistance, but I would have to look that up and vary that. Another thing that's very interesting is the decrease in the riskiness of childbirth has led to people who are economically successful to delay pregnancy. And so this hypothetically could have driven for selection for ovaries that are functioning later. You could also make an argument that the increased survival rate of young may be what's driving puberty to move forward, but I would have to, I don't know, that's just me speculating, so that's a little bit more complicated. The book also poses the question, how does birth control control the time into pregnancy now that basically we've been able to decouple sex and reproduction, and those are now largely under a woman's control. But this is largely influenced by like socioeconomic status, culture, and religious preferences, so it gets really, really complicated. The last thing we're going to talk about is the book spends a little bit of time talking about race. And the crux of the story is there is no, race is a social construct, not a biological construct. And it's an important social construct, don't get me wrong. It's just not something that you observe. Like you can't look at something biologically and say that, well, these are the 15,000 genes that control what it is to be African American. And the simple reason is that most of our race, our concept of race, is based upon skin pigmentation. And there's only a handful of genes that control skin pigmentation. There's only like 10 or 11 genes. The variability between two random people, in any two random people on this planet, the variability in the types of genes they express and the alleles that they express is greater than the differences between two different races. So just like the background differences between individuals is much greater than anything we've been able to link to race. I mean, there are certain genes that are found within certain races, but in the same way, there are certain genes that are found within certain family lineages and local variations. So it's just, race is not a biological thing, but it is a social thing, and it's an important social thing. I'm not saying it's not important, I'm just saying it's not biological.